This episode of Blockchain 360 is only made possible by listeners like you. If you listen to the show on your Apple Podcast app, remember to give us a review. Every review helps more people find the show and join our amazing community. For more information about this episode or for easy access to related programming, visit our website at blockchain360.co and subscribe to our free email list. Enjoy this episode.
This is the Blockchain 360 podcast. Blockchain 360 is a podcast of interviews and discussions about the current state and direction of blockchain. Thank you for joining us today. If this is your first time listening, then thank you for coming. The Blockchain 360 podcast is produced weekly for your enjoyment, and show notes are found at our website, blockchain360.co. Come back often and feel free to add the podcast to your favorite RSS feed or iTunes. You can also follow us on Twitter at Blockchain360. All links discussed today are included in the show notes.
Hi, my name is Brian Nielsen, and I'm your host here on the Blockchain 360 podcast, where we talk about things that impact blockchain. My guests today, I have two of them actually. They're co-founders of a company called Kadena. The first one is Will, and prior to starting Kadena, he worked in JP Morgan's emerging technology group along with Stuart Popejoy, where he built Juno, JP Morgan's first blockchain, which was effectively the JP Morgan coin version 0. Before that, he was a senior science advisor for the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, where he got his start in blockchain. He was there when Val started the cryptocurrency working group, and they needed a tech lead to help. And Stuart, his other co-founder, he's been coding for over 25 years with 15 years of experience building trading systems and exchange backbones for the financial industry. And before starting Kadena in 2016 with his co-founder, he led the blockchain team at JP Morgan in the new products division. He is a comparative lit major from UC Berkeley and graduated in 92 and is a gigging New York City musician. And he loves decentralized and rock solid technology. Gentlemen, welcome to the Blockchain 360.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks. We're psyched to be here.
Yeah, actually, one of the things that we talked about before we started recording was when we first met. We actually had the opportunity to meet first 2 years ago in Chicago at the trading show. And I was giving a couple of segments in there, presentations, and I think you were either before me or right after me at one of those segments.
Yeah, I think were you wearing the Hawaiian shirt, or who was wearing the Hawaiian shirt? Somebody was.
No, it wasn't me. But that was the first time I ever heard about you guys. And that was just right when you were first being spun off from JP Morgan. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, and the talk at that time was about smart contracts, because we really felt that people needed to think more about them, and that actually hasn't changed. We still find ourselves at the forefront and in the position of educating people about what smart contracts are for, and how they really will drive the transformation of bringing business onto blockchain. So that was our story then, and I remember your presentation was really helpful in terms of giving people kind of the bigger context of Bitcoin and Ethereum and thinking about blockchain as a whole.
Yes, that is correct. So I really want to though while your bios give me a brief and the listeners a brief perspective of where you came. How is it that the two of you ended up coming into the blockchain space? If you just each take a moment and share with us how that actually occurred, that would be great.
Sure. Well, I'll start. Although I think our stories are, Will has a significantly different story on this. In my case, as you mentioned, my background is in trading technology, at least for the last, 16 years. And I had been working at JP Morgan building trading technology. And I'd gotten to a place where I wanted to start researching new kinds of technologies and things like that, and got the chance to work with the research group that the new products division, as you mentioned. And that was exciting because it was a chance to kind of have an impact on JP Morgan's overall strategy in terms of what they were doing at the bank and what kinds of technologies they wanted to get into. And blockchain immediately came up. And the reason why was one, because JP Morgan wanted to get involved in strategic investment in things like in various blockchain efforts. Like that was, we joined the Hyperledger Foundation. We're a founding member. Um, we really ended up talking to every single group that was involved in blockchain at the time. Vitalik came in of Ethereum. Every player that you see right now, we were working with. We were part of all of our threes working groups. So I think what made that really interesting for us was the opportunity to also be able to innovate and start looking at building blockchain solutions that would address the problems that we were seeing that were not being answered by the community at the time, by the vendor community. Um, and that's really, I think, for me, where a lot of the passion for this comes from, is that blockchain kind of offers this enticing future of everything kind of working as it should, everything being secure, having kind of payments and all these things kind of magically integrated. But we weren't seeing that promise then, and we're just starting to see the promise now of how an organization could use blockchain both internally and externally to really bring new products to market and really transform things. We saw the beginnings of that at JP Morgan, and indeed one of the first things we did was build a blockchain prototype that was version 0 of JPM coin. In other words, a payments platform, a blockchain based payments platform that would make it possible for JP Morgan to treat their internal liquidity with some of the kind of transparency and ease by which something like a Bitcoin is. And, one of the great things about Bitcoin is that it maintains itself. You don't need a huge operations staff. And whereas like a huge global bank like JP Morgan spends billions of dollars every year trying to keep one of these things going. So that's how it started for me, and I found the tech problems really interesting and rewarding, and wanted to keep going from there.
Okay, Will?
Yeah, so I first heard about blockchain. I want to say it was around 2010, right as I was graduating college. And I think I've read the Bitcoin white paper right around the time that it was launching, or maybe a short time thereafter. Thought it was interesting, looked at the whole proof of work consensus protocol, thought that was cool, but was really unsure if it would actually pan out and work. And just knew that it needed a few years to be out in the wild to be able to go and prove whether or not proof of work was this new type of consensus protocol where you can actually have a bunch of people who don't know each other and don't trust each other come together to form this common ledger. And I, after graduating, went and worked as a software engineer at a couple different places, and then ended up at the Securities and Exchange Commission. Actually, a guy who I was at the same company as for my first job. He was in the hedge fund that they were starting up there. He called me up one day and said, "Hey, we got this position opened up in this group at the SEC that I'm in. Um, do you think that you'd be interested in coming on board? We're basically an internal tech startup. We're going to be building these technology solutions for the government because they just don't have the ability to go through the reams of quantitative trading data that they need to." So I ended up jumping on board. I have kind of an altruistic streak and thought it was, to a certain extent, a duty to go and try to make the system better. Because I was mildly of the opinion that the SEC was part of the reason that the 2008 collapse was allowed to happen. And I thought that I could go in and help with better tools. And when I was there, we built this amazing forensic data analysis system called NEAT, the National Exam Analytics Tool. It's now nationally deployed. And when I was there, Valerie founded the cryptocurrency working group. and they needed a tech lead who understood the tech but didn't own any coin and had the proper clearance. So I raised my hand to go in. That's part of being in the government, is that in these early meetings you get to be in the room and see kind of what's going on, help people to understand things. And from a regulatory perspective, blockchain is just this amazing advancement because you have a ledger where you can't cook the books, and that is incredible. So there has been this huge push in financial compliance for this thing called CAT, the Consolidated Audit Trail, which is, if you squint hard enough, it looks a lot like a general purpose blockchain ledger. Just a common format for everyone to put all of their transactions down so that we can go through them quickly and efficiently. And I was at the SEC for a couple of years. Was on that group, the cryptocurrency working group, for I think it was around 6 months. Worked a couple cases, and then got kind of tired of the. Um, so I got kind of tired of the being inside of the government, and I went to actually Hacker School, which is now Recurse Center, to go and learn Haskell because I wanted a break and I wanted to learn this language. And at the end of that 3 month stint, I was looking for a job and found that one of my friends from college was working at JP Morgan. He was Stuart's first hire for this R&D desk, and they were working in Haskell, and I lived in Brooklyn, and it was 2 stops away on the train, and it was at JP Morgan, so the salary was great, and I just jumped on board and was like, yeah, great, this is exactly what I want. The And then we started working on a bunch of different things, and eventually started working on blockchain. And Stuart pretty much covered how that developed. We really just started building our R&D project because we wanted to see if we could build something that could solve the problems that we were immediately seeing with all of these vendors. From very basic things of how do you upgrade a smart contract to how do you get enough performance to be able to do anything? How do you get more than 8 replicating nodes to work? So we built Juno and then eventually open sourced it. And we're at JP. We realized that you're not going to be able to push a emerging disruptive technology in from inside of a bank. So we left and found it.
So that's when you guys left. You decided that it was better to be outside of an institution as big as JP Morgan and start your own firm. So one of the questions that I always like to find out is how did you select your company name, and is there any meaning to it?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, naming's always a funny thing, and we wanted to have something that was kind of catchy and blockchain related. So, a lot of this is usually based around like a URL search or things like that. So, we wanted to find something that wasn't taken. And I ended up doing a lot of work looking at various words for chain, and one of the ones I have a musician background, and one of the most interesting ones is cadenza, which has a really interesting meaning in music, as well as it just means chain in Italian. And then there's a bunch of related words that come off of it. The one we ended up with is actually the word for chain and or lock in Tagalog.
Tagalog.
Yeah. So it's always funny when we meet somebody from the Philippines because they're like, "Is that what I think it is?" And it's like, "Yes, it is." So that was kind of how we came across it, but we just liked it because it's very snappy um, and we like the kind of association with chain. At that point, we were just a private blockchain company, but now we have our chain web product, which is like I would say when we started, we were like 50-50 smart contracts and private blockchain, but now we've added, a big push into public blockchain, and really we talk about hybrid blockchain now.
All right, we're going to get into that in a second. So again, the question that I have outside of the naming convention that you had is why did you find it necessary to actually leave the confines of a safe environment like JP Morgan and say, you know what, I have to go out and build my own technology?
Well, in that case, what we found was that JP Morgan, for all of their, JP Morgan's got a great brand in blockchain, and they've really done some very interesting things. At the time, though, it was pretty clear they hadn't really figured that out yet. And we really ran into some roadblocks that made it clear to us that JP Morgan wasn't ready to take this on as a tech kind of as a tech, they weren't ready to kind of mount the tech assault to really. We
Right,
had a
right.
really promising blockchain product that we open sourced for Hyperledger called Juno. That's the basis that formed the basis of our private blockchain technology scalable BFT, which really distinguishes itself in terms of performance over, huge network sizes, which we always thought was very important. If you're going to like take a blockchain product that is supposed to scale, you need to be able to make it scale when you bring in more participants who are running nodes. So we had a very exciting product there, but when we open sourced and presented it to Hyperledger, for instance, JP Morgan wouldn't even give us a press release. Uh,
Really?
indeed, indeed, they wouldn't even. JP Morgan wasn't willing to have a JP Morgan GitHub. So, and they weren't even willing to release it
Wow.
as themselves. Juno actually got released on Will's private GitHub. So it was like you'd go to github.com/wjmartino/Juno. So we really felt that, this wasn't really that surprising if you think about it. The reason why JP Morgan was getting involved in blockchain was not to distinguish themselves as a tech company. It was to get involved in strategic partnerships across the industry and solve problems at the bank, which we were doing with the first pilot of JPM Coin, which we rolled out, globally. We rolled it. We had a prototype running in Japan, London, and New York, doing 2,000 transactions per second.
Wow.
Yeah, so I mean, it was a really promising thing, but we felt like that we had, in completing the phase 0 pilot, we had shown the viability of this technology, and meanwhile we couldn't get JP Morgan to put their name behind it. So we felt that private blockchain was very hot, and and we had an idea of how to do smart contracts better. So we said, you know what, let's go do this ourselves, and that way we can really push this technology, and when the time is right, we can bring it back to JP Morgan and all the other banks who will be needing this as this technology matures.
Sure. So what makes your product different than other blockchains?
Well, one thing is, probably the biggest thing is that we focus on hybrid blockchain as the key differentiator of Kadena. We offer a complete ecosystem of private and public blockchain options and a simple smart contract language that joins them. So the idea is that blockchain needs to be scalable, and you really need to consider both private blockchain and public blockchain. And when you start investing in this technology as a company, one of the first things you have to do is learn a smart contract language. And so we offer Pact, which is really simple to use and can be even understood by non-programmers. And the idea is that way you're not like it. Pretty much with any other blockchain platform right now, you're making a bet on whether or not you want to be entirely public or entirely private. And as we're increasingly seeing, there's more interest in these things that really blur the boundaries between them. And we're really the platform that gives you the right tools to take advantage of both, which is really where we see the future of blockchain
So
really
do you think
developing.
that your product is it a hybrid product? I mean, is there a public component to it or a permissionless component to it as well as a permissioned, and then you're basically straddling the two? I mean, is your product all things, or is it actually just engaging with other existing blockchains in that position?
So the way that I would describe it, and of what really differentiates Kadena from other platforms and other approaches and projects, is that we have always had, from the very first day, an unwavering focus on business. And this meant that we ended up being early to enterprise blockchain. Now that we see with Libra coming out that the idea that enterprise blockchain is never going to take off or be taken seriously, that is now fully debunked. You have 27, 28 major partners talking about deploying effectively an enterprise private blockchain. And then as we continued to validate that the product was able to solve real business needs and do it very quickly, we were able to see that, okay, you need to have a public piece of infrastructure that you can link these private blockchains to. So, as an example, take JP Morgan Coin. JP Morgan Coin right now runs internally. It does a small minority of the transactions that JP Morgan does for cross bank transfers between different branches in different geolocations. And this saves them something along the lines of 20% of their compliance costs for that service that they provide to the bank. Now, JP Morgan coin is interesting and it's useful for the bank, but it doesn't really get its teeth until they take the next step and they make a public smart contract that goes on to a public chain like Kadena's chain web that is linked by a server to the private JP Morgan coin. Because then this allows you to have an account in JP Morgan that's in USD. You convert some of those dollars into JP Morgan coin tokens, and then you can actually move those onto a public chain. So you can have an account on a public chain that's backed by JP Morgan that has some US dollar token amount in that account. And we see the business universe progressing in such a way that you're going to see multiple people making coins, and you're not going to the idea that you're going to have all of these different coins like JP Morgan coin or Goldman coin or Samsung coin or Mizohu coin, all linking directly to each other on day one, or at least initially, doesn't really make much sense. We're going to get to an internet of blockchains, but it's going to take this in between step where you're actually linking these different things, these different coins that are running on private chains through some public piece of infrastructure like Chainweb. So we straddle both, but it's really that we have two different products, one public and one private consensus protocol that each run the same smart contract language that's incredibly easy to use and learn, but is also easy to link a public deployment and a private deployment together.
Now, you both have mentioned Pact, which is your language for smart contracts. Can you tell us a little bit about how that was developed and why it's so much easier to use than, say, other languages for smart contracts?
Yeah, I mean, Pact is a big part of our story, and one of the interests, going back to the research group at JP Morgan, we had a team of part of my team actually, the person that Will mentioned was his friend who was on the team was developing a smart contract language while they were there. But it was very advanced, and it was the kind of thing that was going to be very hard for a lot of programmers to understand, and is really very similar to what some companies like Digital Asset and other Tezos and some of these other people have offered. The theme is having a smart contract language that is safe. And what does that mean? Safe means that, well, for one, that you don't have the kind of bugs that we've seen that have plagued Ethereum. Ethereum has had a number of high-profile bugs that have resulted in losses in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And usually they're caused by bugs that a programmer would have a very hard time testing for or guarding against in advance. So you want a smart contract language that's safe. So that's what Pact was really designed for. It has features that make it kind of inherently safer than, say, something like Ethereum. For instance, it's what people call Turing incomplete. This means that you can't ever have a runaway loop. You can't ever have code calling itself. You have, in sense of calling itself in a loop. And it has a bunch of things like this to make it impossible for programmers to shoot themselves in the foot. You can always have logic problems. You can always have bugs that where the code isn't doing what you want it to. What you don't want is some kind of crazy new capability that comes up because somebody has done a low-level exploit. You really don't want to expose those kinds of things. So the other thing was to make it human readable. So this was the idea that you could go onto the blockchain when you're calling a smart contract and actually look at the code and know that the code you're calling is what you read. And most importantly, be able to understand that code. So it's very important that it be simple. And this is really what Pact is all about. The final component, though, is really pretty exciting is the fact that Pact offers the ability to perform formal verification-based proofs using small snippets of code right inside of your smart contract, such that you can prove things. You can actually do something that is actually very hard to do in programming in general, which is prove that your code has no bugs. It's one thing to test your code and say like, oh, I want to make sure that when the user types in 10, that the code does what I want it to, for some transfer or something like that. And it's this process by which the programmer is basically guessing what kinds of inputs could cause problems and running that through the system to make sure that they don't. Formal verification, on the other hand, mathematically constructs the entire space of possible inputs and proves that those inputs cannot lead to a faulty result. So it's really it's kind of almost magical in terms of what it can do, and under the hood, what it's doing is it's converting your entire program into a mathematical model so that it can put these proofs together. But what you end up with is a language that is easier to use, safer by design, and then in terms of like making sure your business logic doesn't have bugs, has this incredibly powerful tool of formal verification to basically root out bugs at the logic level. Recently, we released Pact 3.0, which introduced all sorts of new exciting features around these things, like the ability to craft different kinds of ownership schemes that make it really easy to do some of the more complicated things we see in Bitcoin, such as like payment channels and things like that. There's a technology called capabilities that allows you to really come up with very succinct and easy to understand ways to express these different ownership models. So Pact has always been, a big part of what we think smart contracts should look like, and it's based on like, our understanding of like, what trading systems use for when they want to express a particular kind of trading strategy. That's something I did while I was at J.P. Morgan, was wrote them a trading algorithmic trading domain specific language that was used by sales traders. So these are not technical people, but they could get a call from a client and be able to write code that could be deployed in 24 hours into production and start. And that was responsible for like 20 million year on year revenues at JP Morgan. So that's some of the background that we bring to this. And, Pact, what we've really seen with Pact is that a development team can learn Pact in a matter of days. One of our first clients was a healthcare, Fortune 100 healthcare company that started the Synaptic Alliance, which is a major blockchain alliance in healthcare. And they were able to complete their Pact prototype in 6 weeks. And it was kind of funny. There was a major consultancy working on the product that came through with their big report on what a blockchain solution should look like. And they were saying, well, this is going to be so hard to implement in Ethereum that we think everything shouldn't happen on the blockchain and we should just be time stamping. And it was funny because the devs, not our devs, but the healthcare company's devs they were like, yeah, we're already done with our prototype. And so we've had this experience over and over again. We have a client we're going to be making an announcement soon about a fintech client that is switching off of Ethereum. They spent like a good year building their product on Ethereum, and with a lot of trepidation because Ethereum is so unsafe and it's really a very difficult tooling environment. It's just very hard to use. Not only did they get their main use case done and deployed on Pact in under 2 weeks, they then gave us this fantastic demo with this beautiful front end. So, I mean, developers really, even though Pact is written for non-developers, that actually makes life better for developers because, I mean, we liken it to like writing Excel formulas. Excel formulas are very powerful, but nobody ever crashed a computer system writing an Excel formula. I mean, someone might have crashed the economic system using Excel, like some crazy trader, but nobody ever crashed their computer writing an Excel formula. And we feel that smart contracts should be the same way. You might be able to do all sorts of crazy things with a smart contract in the business sense, but you shouldn't be able to have these kinds of horrible bugs and exploits because real money is on the line. That's what we learned when we were at JP Morgan. You need to, the smart contract language that you write applications in has to be safe enough for companies that have, trillions of dollars on the line, but easy enough for a small entrepreneur to be able to get their use case out the door in, less than a week.
All right. Now, one of the things, though, that you're facing is that you have a number of competitors with deep pockets and long legacies. As you pointed out, Ethereum has been around for a long time, and a lot of companies have spent millions and millions of dollars creating proof of concepts and even doing nominal deployments on that blockchain. So, what do you think that you bring to the table in your go-to-market strategies that differentiates yourself from these
It's a great
competitors?
question, and we are thankful for a lot of our competitors for having done the initial education period. It's not uncommon for us to go to a client and find that they've already been pitched and actually done a proof of concept on IBM's Hyperledger Fabric. They actually found, sometimes even find a good business use case for the application that IBM built with them, only to find that when they actually go to build the application, that the technology just isn't capable of servicing this new line of business, this new product that they want to bring to the market. And Ethereum as well.
When you say that, wait, Will, when you say that, what do you mean that it's not capable of bringing that application forward
So
to an
I have a
enterprise
couple
deployment?
anecdotes. I think the first thing that I would point to is Stuart's recent op-ed on IBM's product not being a real blockchain and all the different issues alongside of it. For the longest time, it never had a smart contract language, which meant that you were writing these applications in traditional languages, which sounds like, oh, that should be easier for people to use. But it ends up, because of the shape of blockchain and how these applications are structured, it ends up being this huge mess because these things are so unsafe that they have to run in these sandboxes. And even then, the sandboxes, they use Docker, for example. They just aren't safe enough to really trust. From a throughput point of view, IBM still doesn't have a true BFT backing Fabric because their BFT and their initial version used PBFT and they never got it above, I think it was a transaction every couple seconds. So then said they use Kafka, but the problem with Kafka is that it allows for front running, which is just this huge problem for any financial application. On top of that, scaling to more than, I think it's 4 or 6 nodes, replicating servers for an enterprise blockchain application doesn't really work in IBM Fabric. You can kind of tweak the settings in such a way that you can get a benchmark out the door, but that's about it. When you try to really build real applications, the technology is just not there. And kind of the last bit of it is that, well, it's kind of difficult to say. It's just you end up in this position where you have this business use case that you want to express, and oh, blockchain is supposed to be this thing that just runs itself, and it's very easy to use, and it's very easy to get. It's not easy to use, but it's easy to run. Like Bitcoin, once you have the software downloaded and it's running, you don't really need to maintain it. It maintains itself, as Stuart was pointing out before. That isn't the case with something like Fabric. You end up having to do this enormous developer operation lift to keep these systems running and from falling over. So you end up in this position where you've tried to go and actually build this thing and go express it, and then it just keeps unfortunately falling over.
Hmm. So one of the questions I have is this: is you guys have both talked about your platform and especially your scripting language for smart contracts. Well, how will the everyday person most likely begin to use your technology? Will it be in writing those smart contracts, or how is it going to
So I
actually occur?
believe that the way that the average everyday person is going to interact, it's going to be that these smart contracts are going to be behind the scenes. But that's the much longer term vision. That's 3 to 5 years out as we get over the chasm and we get to the the early majority and then the technology just truly taking off. In the meantime, you're going to see, in a similar way to how Ethereum has built its community, a bunch of smaller developers using it, but also a number of businesses. The way that developer communities traditionally get built outside of just hobbyist communities that sometimes spring up, and Ethereum is one of these examples where they actually manage to have a hobbyist community pop up. Usually, the way that a developer community is created is that there are developers who are getting paid to learn and use the language because there are businesses that are using the technology to go and make money. And that's where our focus on business makes a massive competitive advantage for us because we've always been focused at real applications and on doing real business. That means that we have been building up our enterprise sales channel and our small and medium sized business sales channel for years. And anyone who has experience in trying to actually get technology, innovative, disruptive technology to the masses and actually get users for it knows that those sales cycles take a long time to build. You can't just pivot to, oh, we're now blockchain for business. Because we did a funding round and we have some big family offices that invested in us. you can't just do that pivot lightly. It takes a long time to actually build those relationships and to build the collateral and the technology and the team needed to go and see it through.
We need to now take a small break. We're forever grateful to our corporate sponsors. The sponsor who's been with us since the launch of the Blockchain 360 podcast is the Blockchain Academy. The Blockchain Academy is a global leader in blockchain training. Their latest initiative is the 10K Blockchain Developers Training Initiative. The Blockchain Academy is seeking to train 10,000 developers on Hyperledger Fabric, Hyperledger Sawtooth, Corda, and EOS. Enterprises and developers can learn more about their comprehensive boot camps by visiting their websites at theblockchainacademy.com/10kbdi. We'll now return to our podcast. Well, one of the things I'm getting out of this conversation is that you're basically saying, or at least what I'm hearing is that blockchain technology, for the most part, speaking of Ethereum and Hyperledger, which are the two platforms you've mentioned, are not really enterprise ready. So what are the most important things for blockchain adoption that people are not thinking about right now? Stuart, Will?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. um, I mean, the thing that people really aren't thinking about is everybody's, like when Libra came out, there was a lot of really interesting discussions. And honestly, I think for whatever you feel about Facebook, and that's, most of us don't have very necessarily charitable views towards them, but one of the things they're really doing is they're really accelerating this conversation in terms of like really talking about usability. Um, One of the biggest things that hasn't happened yet is this real notion of a service economy. Blockchain is the
What do you
first.
mean by that?
Well, I could kind of relate it to something that happened, when APIs kind of hit the cloud, which was really kind of driven by mobile. But the idea there was that before, anytime you wanted to integrate with some other system, it was really hard and took forever. And not only that, you'd have to like invest a bunch of hardware. Now with cloud and web technologies, someone could publish an API and you could start getting like Google Maps data into your application very quickly. That's great,
Right.
and it's fueled a lot of innovation and a lot of interesting and nifty apps. But here's one thing that's still very hard to do. It's still very hard to do a service and get paid for it via an API. Like in the sense that like Google Maps is out there and it's free and great, and you start using their API. Now you're going to go sign up with them and do something else and get into some kind of subscription and basically get into bed with them and and have to kind of negotiate all those things, because you can't just go to an API and just pay for it, and on a per usage basis. The
Right.
idea with what blockchain will offer when we really have a services economy is the ability for some service provider to be basically able to differentiate themselves on on the level of service they're providing and get people to pay for it. And that seems like it wouldn't work because especially on public blockchain, because everything on public blockchain is public. But the idea is that you really want these applications using each other to offer new things to the public. So like, for instance, you could have a market data provider. This is somebody who does a really good job putting together prices for Bitcoin and Ethereum, or even like, stocks or other financial instruments.
Or
And
any
that's a
instrument,
hard thing to do.
actually. Yeah.
What's that?
Any
Yeah, that's a hard
instrument.
thing to do. Yeah, and and especially with crypto, that would be hard. And the point is that it takes some expertise. So like, meanwhile, you want to do some kind of product that needs to have a Bitcoin price to, maybe you're going to offer some kind of new stable coin, or you're offering some insurance product, or anything that an entrepreneur might think of, where they need to have a supply of kind of good data, and they don't want to be responsible for maintaining the quality of that data. Sure, they could go scrape it from somewhere, but the point is this is part of their business model. So they're not, they would much rather pay somebody to do that. So somebody who basically hangs out a shingle on a public blockchain, offering a service that gives you high quality market data, and all you have to do is give them some umpteenth value of of the coin of the if this was on Ethereum, it'd be some small amount of Ethereum. If it's on Kadena, it'd be some small amount of Kadena coin. And the idea there is that now this person can basically they can pay for this they can pay for having this data available to them, and presumably because they're going to offer some kind of service that they're charging for. And now but you can't do that right now with something like Ethereum, because Ethereum is so hard to write safe smart contracts in that it's hard enough for you to write your own smart contract that's not going to cost you, that's not going to have a bug that's going to cost you $100 million. So there's no way that you'd ever trust somebody else's smart contract. You're never going to like call their code in the middle of your code, because it would entail so much risk. With Pact, because Pact is simple, because Pact is human readable, so you can actually look at the code you're calling, because there's formal verification, people will be able to offer these services with the assurance that other businesses will be able to take these things up and start innovating like we've seen with the cloud. You'll be able to do this on a public blockchain, on a private blockchain, and we're really going to, and most importantly, now the money is part of the transaction, unlike cloud. Now, because it's cryptocurrency, you can include the payment right in with the service interaction, and it becomes as decentralized as everything else we see in the cryptocurrency space.
So, how long do you think it will take to have this kind of blockchain adoption, or this new service where you get payments out of it
We'll start seeing it,
arise? How long do you think
and
that
I
will
would say
be?
by this time next year, you're going to see the first few instances of it. We're planning on launching ChainWeb on October 30th with at least one or two applications, and some of them are going to be these service providers. It's going to take a little while for the market to understand that this is a huge step forward, and a lot of people actually forget that one of our competitors, Ethereum, they were pitched for being able to do two things. One was token issuance, but the other was smart services, which is what we're talking about right now. This idea that you could have smart contracts interacting with each other on a public blockchain. They managed to successfully do the first of those two, the token issuance, ICOs, and the rest, and that's put blockchain on even more into the public spotlight. As for the second one, it was a abject and utter failure. Parity multisig, this bug where a bunch of people had this huge amount of funds locked up because someone broke the parent contract that all these other contracts were interacting with. It costs the community, I think it was like 200, $300 million, and Polkadot is still talking about doing a militia or doing an adversarial hard fork to go and get their funds back. And it was one of the main things that they were talking about, and they just weren't able to do it. We are actually able to do it. We actively do it now on a number of our private blockchain projects. So you end up with, to get from where we are today to this smart services economy, you need a few things that really only Kadena can offer. One is that you need a holistic platform that is focused on business. This is our public-private, hybrid stack, so that a business can come in and say, you know what, we're going to do this. We're going to take our AML KYC data that we have to do anyway for our main line of business. We're going to migrate that on partially onto a private blockchain internally. This will then increase efficiencies inside of our company. We can then take a representation, an encrypted representation of that data, and put it onto a public blockchain and actually charge people for access to it. So, you go to lease an apartment, you need to get your bank docs to the person who you're signing the lease from or you're renting from. And there's no reason that you should have to manually do that. I mean, one of the services that your, let's say, JP Morgan Chase could have is that if you have an account, they have a public blockchain contract, and the renting agency can also have some ability to come into that contract and say, hey, can I request this data? I'll pay you this fee, and then off chain in an encrypted fashion, nonetheless, that data is handed over, and I can personally sign off on giving the renter that data because I can sign the transaction where the renter says, I would like this data from the bank, please. I can sign that with my private key and then just hand that signature to the renter, and the renter can just go and run the transaction and get the data that they need. So that's one part. Another part is that you need smart contracts. It's about smart contracts. That's just it. And there hasn't been enough focus on smart contracts for business. You need these things to be able to be legible by lawyers and executives. You need them to be safe enough to actually trust. They need to be legible on chain so that you don't have some compiler bug that all of a sudden turns your multi-million-dollar business upside down. And finally, the last bit is that you need something that has high throughput on a public blockchain. And I'm not talking here about proof of stake or DAGs like Hashgraph or any of these other scaling solutions, air quotes scaling solutions that are really just diminishing the decentralization of a public blockchain, this piece of infrastructure that we can all use that no one owns. You need to have a scaling solution for proof of work, and Kadena is very special. It has a very different place in this market because we actually have the only scaling solution for proof of work, one of the few proof of work projects left. And this is our chain web protocol. It allows you to braid multiple different chains together into one network so that for the same amount of hash rate that you would need for one chain, you can instead have 10 or 100 or 1,000 chains all running in parallel with none of the liquidity problems associated with something closer to a hub and spoke approach or staked channels or any of the other myriad of approaches that you're seeing the crypto sector experimenting with today. And once you have all of those and a company that's been focused on business for years and has the lead time needed to actually be able to go and deploy enterprise applications to a public blockchain in a hybrid context so that there's public and private parts of it that are running together to actually go and demonstrate here's how you make money and here's how you do it. Once you have all of those things, which Kadena has and we are unique for having, then you can start to talk about, okay, how long is it going to take for people to kind of get wind of, whoa, this stuff actually now works? Because to your previous point, yeah, Hyperledger Fabric and Ethereum are not capable of doing real business enterprise work. Little POCs here and there, sure, some small internal stuff, but the second that it needs to go prime time, the second that it needs to go, to the masses and have the scale and the safety that's needed when you're putting real money at risk on these things, those solutions just don't work.
So one of the things that you've talked about here is, of course, is the launch of your product ChainWeb on October 30th of this year, 2019. Can you take us back a little bit and over the last year, cover some of the major milestones that the company has actually done and how it's leading
So
up
one
to
of
this
the
launch?
first major milestones was in January when we put Scalable BFT, which is our private blockchain, onto the Amazon marketplace. This allows people to go have one-click install to be able to go and run one of the, actually I believe it is the fastest private blockchain out there. And this is our private chain that runs Pact. This has gotten very good usage. We've had lots of inbound from doing this, and we're going to be expanding the cloud solution later this year. We then did a number of things. Some was the doing a full security audit with Gauntlet. We're actually Gauntlet's first client to go and show that ChainWeb actually is a safe solution and it does have the security parameters that we need for running it in public. We actually needed to break out techniques that you'd normally only see in HFT for going and proving that the system will be safe. HFT means high frequency trading. So the techniques you use to figure out, when you're trading at the millisecond level, what the market impact of a trade will be. We needed this agent-based simulation to go and create thousands of individuals and have them try to break the network. So then we hit testnet at the end of March. This was a 10-chain network running running around, I think it was around 100 transactions a second. And then there have been successive every 2-month releases of upgraded versions of testnet. We're going to have our version 2 release at the end of this month, beginning of next month. And that one is focused on opening up the testnet for anyone to be able to come on and use, providing a dashboard, things like that. There's been a number of other, really nice kind of announcements during this period as well. The biggest one being USCF. They are a go-to-market partner of ours. They are the people who first figured out how to give retail investors direct exposure to, or real exposure to, oil commodities through a very novel, I think it was a electronically traded network. We've been talking with them for around a year now, and they see our hybrid platform as being the right building blocks for the next generation of products for their entire company. They're all in on it. They are doing both, I believe, an ETF and are doing an ETF with a partner that's also in New York, and they're also working with us on this next gen stuff that we unfortunately can't talk about yet, but I'm really excited to, and we should be able to in around, I think it's a month and a half, 2 months, when some more stuff is publicly known.
All right, so then that brings us up to the launch of ChainWeb. What is your milestones, and what are you looking to achieve in the next 12 to 24 months in terms of the technology?
Well, launch is a big deal. Um,
Yes, that usually is.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things is that this space has been plagued by, lots of high-profile projects that really haven't brought their stuff to market. I mean, one company that isn't like this, that we're very impressed by is Cosmos. Cosmos actually got their first version of their blockchain, rolled out this year. But when we announced that testnet was going to be launched on March 26th of this year, that was something where we really had a chance to show that we could hit a date, and we did. And we got, ChainWeb is the first it is the first multi-chain proof of work blockchain that's ever existed. So, getting that out and showing that it actually works and showing that it isn't just some kind of crazy mess, like uh, the technology under ChainWeb was discussed as long ago as 2014 for something for Bitcoin, but there was concern that it would be too complicated to achieve consensus. We both have the paper that we'll discuss showing that it can't be attacked, and then we actually rolled out the prototype. So and returning to some of these releases, one of the releases that just came in late May uh, was an important thing where we showed the ability to push liquidity across chains, because that's another important part of rolling out a multi-chain blockchain and making it scalable. Because remember, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to take a proof of work blockchain and give it the capacity to handle the level of transactions demanded by the modern financial system using a proven proof of work technology. So these are all really important pieces. Like the way these chains work together really allow us to get more efficiency out of proof of work, which has been criticized for being, not green, for being using up too much energy. And this is a tricky question because on one hand, it's undeniable that proof of work is using up energy. But on the other hand, it has done something that no other computer system has ever been able to do. And frankly, everything else that people are discussing are unproven technologies that have not been proven yet. Bitcoin is proven. Bitcoin has been out since 2009. But the big problem is that it's inefficient. Chainweb, by having multiple chains, allows us to every time we grow the network from, say, 10 chains to 20 chains, the overall energy footprint does not go up, but throughput does. So this is a way that the chain can continually offer more and more utilization with an ever shrinking footprint per transaction. So it's greener than something like Bitcoin or Ethereum. So getting this rolled out is really important because people need to see that proof of work is a sustainable technology, because everybody knows proof of work is safe. Proof of work works. And then realizing the promise of what Ethereum set out to do, like what Will was saying. Ethereum set out to be a services economy. It's set out to be a place where smart contracts were going to autonomously interact with each other. So scalable proof of work, safe smart contracts, this is what we're rolling out on October 30th. And once that happens, a whole bunch of new possibilities. We can start talking about new, then it really becomes clear that public blockchain is ready for business. And so that's what the next 2 years are really about. It's really about bringing these services to public blockchain because there's going to be a lot of, once people realize that this is actually possible, then you're going to see an explosion of interest and new use cases. And we're going to be there working with all of those people to bring these things to market.
All right, so I find this all fascinating. So the listeners are going to be saying to ourselves, I like what I'm hearing. This is absolutely the right approach that I'm hearing. So tell me a little bit about your technical team. I mean, you are both co-founders of Kadena. So can you share with us some of the rest of your technical team? And then also, if you would share with us also a little bit about who your partners are and advisors and investors.
Sure. Well, I'll take the technical part, and thank you, by the way, for saying that. We definitely, we work really hard on what we do, so it's always nice to hear that that message is getting across. um, but yeah, so our, Will and I are both, when we were at JP Morgan, Will was really working on the consensus part, and I'm really more focused on the smart contract side. Originally, we were we're a tech founded company. We build in all of our software in Haskell, which is a very safe application programming language, but that is a little bit hard to learn. But the great thing is you end up being able to hire some really smart people, because they're usually really stoked about working in Haskell. So, for instance, we hired Emily Pillmore, who to work on the language side. She's somebody who has an extensive background in type theory. She's a chartered mathematician, um, and she's one of the lead maintainers of Pact. We hired the two maintainers of the main main high performance web server architecture in Haskell, Doug Beardsley, who is our director of engineering, and Gregory Collins. Gregory Collins, who previously worked at Google in their search team, and was also doing like neural modeling of speech recognition technology in C++. So we really have and finally we have Lars Kutz on our team, who came from Microsoft and was working basically on their internal S3 for their developers. Microsoft needs to be able to ship development builds of Windows all over the world in milliseconds. So he had basically built almost like an internal private blockchain, and has background in all sorts of wonderful things, including cryptography. So it's really a privilege to work with people on this level, and we're all really excited to be kind of focused on getting this thing out the door. I'll let Will talk more about our financial partners and advisors.
Sure, and I want to echo Stu's thanks. It is really great to hear that the message that we've been projecting for the past few years is really starting to sink. I've really, it's really starting to resonate with people. It's been a journey since we left JP Morgan, and I'm really happy to hear that people are starting to really care about, okay, how do we do real business with this stuff? Our initial partners also have heard this message and like it. The first investor we had for the public chain was Metastable. Lucas Ryan was our main point of contact there. Amazing, brilliant individual. But for our various SAFT rounds, we have Multicoin and Coin Fund and Scalar and VI and a number of other, just different crypto funds that all like to see something different. And that was really one of the harder parts when we were raising, was we have a very different value prop than most people. We're not just doing proof of stake with EWASM or sharded proof of stake with EWASM. We're doing something that we went and reimagined from scratch, taking 30 years of collective experience in fintech and in computer science to reimagine and rebuild the financial system effectively, almost from scratch, or at least the bare bones of it. And this is what one of the things that sets us apart, is that we have this background that actually allows us to understand the existing modern financial system in such a way that we don't have to go and reinvent the wheel every time we come to a new problem or issue. This is also how we were able to get funds like Susquehanna or SIG, their crypto fund, as well as the Fidelity Family Office. These are serious financial players that are backing us. And when it comes to our advisors, we have Stuart Haber, who is the most cited author of the Bitcoin white paper, as our cryptography
Yeah,
advisor.
I
He's
actually saw
fantastic.
that, and I was actually very impressed because I've actually had the opportunity to interview Scott Stornetta, and Stewart and he were the ones that came up with the original concept for blockchain. So, I mean, to have him as one of your advisors, I think it's phenomenal.
It's this incredible resource. Yeah, I 100% agree. It's just this incredible resource of having someone who has understood. He invented blockchain, the data structure.
Right.
It's
And has
unparalleled.
been running
And
a
then our
blockchain
other,
since 1996 that publishes in the
I
New
know,
York
and
Times
people don't even
classified.
realize that.
yeah, we're just really flattered and grateful to have him on board. And our other major advisor is Alex Pinchev. He is the former president of Red Hat. He built their enterprise sales team. When it comes to how do you make money on open source tech and how do you drive open source in a business friendly way that can grow into a massive enterprise, he's the guy who basically wrote the playbook on it. He's the one who was in the trenches and did it. He was then at Rackspace afterwards. So between those two, and they are very different advisors to have on an advisory board, but
Absolutely.
man, do they provide profound insight.
I actually met Alex in Moscow at a blockchain conference where we were both speaking, and I had a great evening with him, speaking with him for, I don't know, maybe 45 or 50 minutes. It was really, he's quite an impressive individual. So having those two people, I mean, I know you have others, but just the heavyweight uh, aspects of both of these advisors, it says a lot about what you guys are doing and what your blockchain is trying to achieve.
Thank you. Thank
So
you so much.
one of the last parts that I'd like to think about and talk about with you is that the idea that what you're trying to create, it culminates in a concept that you refer to as the blockchain sharing economy. Can you finish up this interview with kind of an explanation of what that means?
Sure. So this is the end state of when we were talking about smart services before. We talked about them in a very piecemeal way. But okay, one of the keys to understand with this concept, the enterprise sharing economy, is that current companies have certain products that they offer to consumers or to other businesses that they make revenue from, they make money from, and that's how the business runs. But beneath those products that they offer, there are all of these different business units that provide internal services for those mainline, front office products that are being sold and actually making the money to keep the business running. And these units are currently just cost centers. They're necessary cost centers. So, for example, when you go to get a bank account, they don't make money off of doing your AML and KYC compliance checks. But, JP Morgan Chase still nonetheless needs to go and verify your identity, go and look at your credit, make sure that you're not on like some terrorist watch list, a bunch of other stuff. So they have to do this for reasons. If you look at supply chain, there's various parts of a supply chain that don't make money, but they're there for either compliance reasons or just because it makes the business a bit more efficient to have this long-term ledger of local transportation vendors that they can have access to and they can keep reviews of internally just to make sure, okay, we should be using these people versus these people, that type of thing. So there's all these little units that exist in various enterprises. And right now they're just cost centers. What and the enterprise sharing economy is this idea that you can take those cost centers and turn them into revenue generating units as well. Because you need to do this work anyway. You need to do the background check for someone who's making a new account at your bank. But there's no reason that you can't try to monetize that workflow. For the past decade and a half, we've been talking about monetizing data and how data is the next oil. Well, we're kind of at the end stage of that. We've seen effectively how far that goes. And now it may actually be going a little bit too far as we start to hear about what Facebook's actually doing, or Florida selling off DMV records to advertisers, which is just crazy. And I can't believe that I was reading about that this morning. But there is this idea that, okay, you've done data. Well, now what about the workflow that makes a lot of that data? What if you could encapsulate that small chunk of a much larger organization, represent a almost a next gen API, some interface with that workflow, not just the data, and put that onto a public system such that you could then charge people for access to that workflow that you're already doing. So now you don't have to go and actually get your AML and KYC or your customer stuff or your bank records to the person that you're renting an apartment from. the actual know your customer, anti-money laundering, all of that stuff, that desk, that unit inside of a bank actually has a small contract on a public chain that your renting agent can just go and interface with directly. So it allows you to take these cost centers that exist but are necessary for running a business and begin to convert them into revenue generators. And I see this as being possibly the next oil. If data were the previous next oil, then I think that it's taking workflows and encapsulating them and offering them to other people, or even perhaps, and this is one of the more out there ideas, using the workflow as collateral almost, where you end
Explain
up
that.
having, yeah, it's a weird idea that's kind of on the fringes. So let's say you have a supply chain for building, you have some supply chain for some shipping, I don't know, some shipping company that have some supply chain set up, and you were to take that supply chain, the actual operations, the amalgamation of all of the different database tables and the different people's individual kind of jobs of moving one unit through the database in a way that reflects how it's being moved publicly. You can turn that notion, that thing that's getting moved through this process, and effectively tokenize it. And now, once there's a token that represents that unit of inventory moving through the workflow, there's no reason that you can't actually use that as collateral in a kind of strange way. You now have this kind of esoteric buildup of different business functions that comes together to be how this piece of inventory moves. And once there's a tokenization for it, you could actually say, I want to go get a loan, and as collateral, we can only move, let's say 10,000 units through this workflow in a given day. I'm going to go and sell off let's say 1,000 per day of these units and have to maybe buy them back over time, or in 6 months have to buy them back in return for some loan. And then I can use that loan to go and actually build up that infrastructure more, build up that workflow more to add more capacity to it. So you can end up where you can take something that wasn't really tangible, that was just multiple people, multiple systems working together to move the idea of something through a workflow, turn it into something tangible. And then once it's tangible, you can actually start to almost sell it or use it as collateral in this very strange way. It's one of the more out there kind of end states of where this can all go, but it allows you almost direct access to the it's not quite the revenue, but it's the unit of value that's getting moved through this part of the business. Once it's tangible, you can actually go and touch it and do things with it that you never could
Sure.
before.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I've understood about you is you also have an example with Rent the Runway. Would you like to at least tell me a little bit about that particular implementation?
Sure. This is the one that is actually in the Enterprise Sharing Economy blog post, and it touches on a number of the things that we just discussed. So, Rent the Runway, we know about because our first hire and head of research and networks, Monica Quaintance, she is the person who was at Rent the Run, or she worked with me at the SEC briefly, and then went to Rent the Runway, and she moved Rent the Runway from metal servers, like actual rack servers, into the cloud. So she knows where all the bodies are buried. She built most of the infrastructure for this huge inventory supply chain that Rent the Runway has. And Rent the Runway, it may surprise a lot of people to know or not, has the largest dry cleaning warehouse in, I think, North America. I don't think it's the biggest in the world, but I might be wrong on that. It's enormous. And they don't use all of the capacity of that dry cleaning warehouse all year long. They usually use somewhere between like 30 and 40% on a regular basis. And then at peak season times, so holiday parties, that type of thing, or right around prom, they end up using almost all of the capacity that they have in this warehouse. And otherwise, it more or less sits idle. Now, if you were to take so the way that the workflow works at Rent the Runway is, you go and you rent a dress, the dress gets shipped to you, you wear it, and then you ship it back to them. And then once it's been shipped back to them, it goes to this warehouse to go and get cleaned. It has a tag, it has a unique identifier, and it moves through their database in a way that reflects what stage in the cleaning and Q&A process that dress is in. And if you were to take that workflow, all those, the various people involved, the database that actually holds where things are at any given time, and you were to turn that into a smart contract running on a private chain, for one, you'll probably have higher efficiency gains just because the system is way more robust. One of the beauties of blockchain is that business continuity, disaster recovery, high availability, that sort of thing, they're totally commoditized. Once you have a system running on a blockchain, you basically can't kill it without killing every single server that's running it, which is just this beautiful feature for e-commerce platforms and technologies. So once you move on to the private chain, you get some benefit, but the real part where why you would do that migration, like where the revenue comes from actually doing it, the added revenue, not just cost savings, is when you can say, okay, well, you now have these tokens. These tokens represent a unit moving through the cleaning supply chain, shipping on both sides included. What if we were to say, okay, all the excess capacity, all these tokens that aren't actually being moved through the cleaning cycle because there's no demand from our customers for them to be moved through the cleaning cycle yet. What if we were to take our excess capacity and put it onto a public chain? You have a smart contract that is the rent the runway dry cleaning service. And you can then go and actually buy these tokens that represent one unit of inventory moving through the cleaning supply chain at Rent the Runway. And once you've purchased one of these, then you can go and figure out how to actually ship your item to go get dry cleaned to Rent the Runway. It goes through their process and then it comes back. So it allows for very seamless integration where this cost center, this cleaning service that they need fundamentally for their business to use, can now be turned into a revenue generator when they're not using it. And there's a lot of excess capacity. It's trapped liquidity, but it's also trapped capacity in enterprises around the world that right now there's no safe, straightforward, simple, incredibly robust way of exposing to other consumers. No one really thinks about the Rent the Runway dry cleaning warehouse as something that could generate revenue, but it absolutely could. And then once you get at this point, you're talking about enterprises sharing excess capacity, likely either with consumers or more likely with each other. And then all of a sudden, just the world becomes more efficient because there's no reason for, let's say it's a like a prom dress store to have some, local. I mean, the prom dress store could actually use the Rent the Runway service for bulk cleaning after proms, something along those lines, as opposed to having to go and either have some local contract or have some local dry cleaning service open up nearby to be able to service their demand. You can actually just go and use Rent the Runway's excess during the periods of time when they're not using it.
That is great. Gentlemen, I want to thank you both for appearing here on the Blockchain 360 podcast. Again, my guest today is Will Martino and his co-founder, Stuart Popejoy, and they're with Kadena Technology. You can find more information about them and their website by looking in the show notes. We have a link to their website as well as to their Twitters, as well as to their Medium blog posts. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to email us and we'll be happy to pass those messages along. But gentlemen, thank you so much for appearing here on the Blockchain 360 and have a good day.
Thank you so much for having us, Brian.
Thanks so much.
Welcome.
The Blockchain 360 podcast is produced weekly. Have a question? Want us to interview someone specific? Wish to hear about a particular topic? Let us know. You can email me at bryant.nielsen@blockchain360.co or tweet us on Twitter @blockchain360 or at our website blockchain360.co.